January 17th, 1943. 28,000 feet above the frozen fields of occupied France. The air is thin enough to make a man's lungs ache, cold enough to turn breath into clouds of ice crystals inside an oxygen mask. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler sits in the cramped cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, scanning the pale winter sky with the trained eye of a hunter who has survived 63 combat missions. The engine hums with familiar precision. Below, the patchwork landscape spreads like a broken chessboard, villages reduced to charcoal sketches, roads threading through snow-dusted forests, the occasional glint of a frozen canal, catching what little sunlight penetrates the overcast. Stigler's gloved hand rests on the control stick. His squadron flies in loose formation, conserving fuel, watching for the American heavy bombers that have begun appearing with disturbing regularity. The Luftwaffe pilots have learned to respect the flying fortresses, those bristling metal giants that absorb cannon fire and keep flying. But it is not the bombers that concern Stigler this morning. It is the new fighter aircraft the Americans have brought to the European theater. Massive, brutish machines that defy everything German pilots thought they knew about aerial combat. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt first arrived in England in December 1942, delivered to the 56th Fighter Group stationed at Kingscliff. German intelligence officers studied reconnaissance photographs with growing unease. The aircraft was enormous, weighing over 7 tons when fully loaded, nearly twice the mass of a Messerschmitt. Its radial engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, produced 2,000 horsepower and drove a propeller nearly 13 feet in diameter. Luftwaffe analysts predicted it would be sluggish, a lumbering escort fighter, easily outmaneuvered by the nimble 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s that had dominated European skies since 1940. The German pilots shared this confidence. They had built their reputations on superior training, superior tactics, and aircraft that could turn inside anything the British or Americans fielded. The P-47 looked like a barrel with wings, a triumph of American industrial excess over aerodynamic elegance. They called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, and the name carried a hint of derision. How could such a beast possibly compete with fighters designed for grace and agility? The answer came not in the horizontal plane where dogfights had always been won, but in the vertical dimension where gravity and mass transformed into weapons more devastating than any cannon. Franz Stigler first encountered a P-47 on February 4, 1943, during an interception mission over Saint Omer. He remembers the moment with the clarity of trauma. His squadron had bounced a formation of American bombers, diving through their fighter screen in the classic Luftwaffe tactic: speed and surprise, strike from above, break away before the escorts could respond. Stigler had just lined up a crippled B-17, his Revy gun sight painting the bomber's port wing, when his wingman's voice crackled through the radio. Indianer, high at 2 o'clock. Enemy fighters. He pulled back on the stick, rolling left, searching the sky for the threat. What he saw defied comprehension. 3 P-47s were diving, not descending in a controlled attack run, but plummeting like stones, like meteors, their massive forms shrinking as they accelerated past 400 miles per hour, past 500, their wings producing a distinctive howl as air tore across control surfaces never meant to move that fast. Stigler had seconds to react. He pushed the stick forward, diving to escape, but the Thunderbolts fell faster than seemed possible, faster than his Messerschmitt could ever hope to dive, their pilots clearly trusting in structural strength that German engineers would never have dared to build into an airframe. The physics were brutally simple, though their implications would take months for Luftwaffe tactical officers to fully comprehend. The P-47's enormous weight, combined with its phenomenally powerful engine and robust construction, gave it dive performance that no contemporary fighter could match. In level flight, a Messerschmitt Bf 109G could reach perhaps 385 miles per hour. In a steep dive, it might touch 470 before control surfaces began to flutter and structural stress threatened catastrophic failure. The P-47 could exceed 550 miles per hour in a dive, and its pilots knew it would hold together. Alexander Kartvelli, the Georgian engineer who designed the Thunderbolt for Republic Aviation, had built it to withstand forces that would tear apart lighter aircraft. The wings could handle dive speeds that induced compressibility effects, that strange realm where air began behaving less like a fluid and more like a solid barrier, where shock waves formed and control surfaces lost effectiveness. American test pilots had explored these edges during development, documenting the aircraft's behavior in dives so steep that altimeters couldn't keep pace with descent rates exceeding 6,000 feet per minute. They had learned that the P-47 would warn them before it broke. Control stick forces would build, the aircraft would buffet and shake, giving pilots time to ease back and recover. German fighters, optimized for rate of turn and climb performance, offered no such margins. A Messerschmitt pilot who followed a Thunderbolt into a full-power dive risked compressibility lock, the terrifying condition where control surfaces froze in position and the aircraft became an unguided projectile. Several Luftwaffe aces died this way, chasing American fighters into terminal velocity dives they could not escape. The tactical revolution began in the spring of 1943 as American pilots learned to exploit their aircraft's unique capabilities. The 56th Fighter Group, commanded by Colonel Hubert Zemke, developed what they called dive and zoom tactics. Instead of engaging in turning fights where German fighters held the advantage, P-47 pilots would maintain altitude, use their superior dive speed to strike at high velocity, then zoom back up to altitude using the energy gained in the dive. Captain Robert Johnson, who would become one of the war's leading aces, described the sensation in his combat diary. You push the stick forward, and the jug just goes. The acceleration is like nothing else. You feel the G-forces build as you point the nose down, and suddenly, you're not flying anymore. You're falling with purpose. The airspeed indicator climbs past 400, 450, 500, and the whole aircraft is shaking, humming like a tuning fork. You line up the enemy fighter. He's trying to turn, trying to evade, but he looks like he's standing still because you're closing at 200 miles per hour faster than he's moving. Your thumb finds the trigger on the stick, and 850 caliber machine guns open up, and that's all she wrote. The psychological impact on German pilots proved as devastating as the tactical advantages. Luftwaffe fighter doctrine, refined through years of combat in Spain and Poland and France and Russia, emphasized the importance of maintaining initiative and dictating engagement terms. A fighter pilot's survival depended on situational awareness, on seeing the enemy first, on converting altitude advantage into a successful attack. The P-47 inverted these calculations. German pilots found themselves unable to escape American fighters diving from above, unable to pursue American fighters climbing away after an attack, and unable to predict when or where the next attack would come. The sky, which had once been a three-dimensional battlefield where skill and training determined outcomes, became a hunting ground where physics gave the Americans an advantage no amount of experience could overcome. Oberfeldwebel Heinz Knoke, a veteran with 21 confirmed victories, wrote in his diary after encountering P-47s over Oldenburg, "These American machines are devils. They come from nowhere, diving so fast we cannot even attempt an evasion. By the time we see them, they have already fired and are gone, climbing back to altitude where we cannot follow. Our 109s are nimble, responsive. We can turn inside them in horizontal combat, but they refuse to fight in the horizontal. They fight vertically, using gravity as an ally, and we have no counter." The engineering that made this possible represented a distinctly American approach to aviation design, one that prioritized durability and power over the European emphasis on efficiency and agility. The R2800 double wasp engine that powered the P-47 was a masterpiece of industrial manufacturing, an 18-cylinder radial that produced over 2,000 horsepower while maintaining remarkable reliability. Each engine required hundreds of precisely machined components, pistons that operated within tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, connecting rods forged from chrome-molybdenum steel, a supercharger system that maintained power output at altitudes where air pressure was a fraction of sea level values. Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, New York, produced these engines by the thousands, each one interchangeable, each one backed by a supply chain that could deliver spare parts anywhere in the world within weeks. This was American abundance made manifest, not elegant solutions using minimal resources, but robust systems that overwhelmed problems through sheer material superiority. German pilots, accustomed to aircraft that required careful management of engine temperature and fuel mixture, found themselves facing opponents who could firewall their throttles for extended periods, confident their engines would not fail. The contrast symbolized larger differences in industrial capacity. While Messerschmitt factories struggled to produce 200 aircraft per month, with increasingly scarce materials and dwindling numbers of skilled workers, Republic Aviation was delivering over 400 P-47s monthly by mid-1943, each one equipped with 8 50-caliber machine guns and ammunition supplies that German pilots found almost obscene. An American fighter pilot carried approximately 3,000 rounds, enough for 20 sustained bursts. A German pilot typically carried less than a quarter of that, forcing him to make every burst count. The symbolic power of the Thunderbolt extended beyond its performance specifications. To German pilots who had grown accustomed to shortages and substitutions, who flew aircraft with fabric-covered control surfaces and fuel tanks made from pressed steel instead of aluminum, the P-47 represented an enemy with unlimited resources. The aircraft itself became a psychological weapon, a daily reminder that Germany was fighting not just America, but American industrial might, the vast productive capacity of a continent-sized nation that could afford to build fighters weighing 7 tons and power them with engines requiring exotic alloys and precision manufacturing. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gobreski, who would finish the war with 28 confirmed victories, all achieved in P-47s, recalled the effect on captured German pilots. We'd bring them to our airfield after they'd been shot down, and they'd stand there looking at rows of Thunderbolts, dozens of them, all identical, all new, and you could see something break inside them. They'd been told Germany was winning, that American production figures were propaganda. Then they'd see this, aircraft as far as the eye could see, fully fueled, fully armed, crews waiting to fly them. One pilot told me, "We shoot down 5 of you, and 10 more appear. Where do they come from?" I didn't have the heart to tell him. There were thousands more where those came from. The dive became the defining characteristic of P-47 combat tactics, the signature move that separated life from death in the lethal mathematics of high-altitude warfare. American pilots learned to trust their aircraft in ways German pilots could not. They learned that the Thunderbolt would pull out of dives that would have destroyed lighter fighters, that its wings would stay attached, even when compressibility buffet shook the entire airframe, that the big radial engine would keep producing power even when intake air became supersonic turbulence. This trust enabled aggression. P-47 pilots developed a reputation for pressing attacks when prudence suggested breaking off, for diving into situations where escape seemed impossible, secure in the knowledge their aircraft could simply dive away from any threat. The aircraft's nickname evolved, still called Jug by its pilots, but now with affection rather than derision, an acknowledgement of the machine's brutal effectiveness. In the terse language of combat reports, phrases appeared with increasing frequency. Engaged enemy aircraft at 28,000 feet, dived to 18,000 feet at indicated 520 miles per hour, fired burst from 300 yards, observed strikes on fuselage and wing root. Enemy aircraft entered spin, did not recover. The clinical language concealed the violence of these encounters. The howl of air across wings, stressed to their limits. The hammering roar of 8 machine guns firing simultaneously. The sudden transition from predator to prey, as German pilots realized too late they were being hunted by machines they could neither outrun nor escape. The transformation in aerial combat doctrine rippled through both air forces. The United States Army Air Forces recognized they had stumbled onto a tactical advantage that negated traditional fighter pilot skills. Dive and zoom tactics required different training than the dogfighting emphasized in pre-war flight schools. New pilots arriving in England received instruction focused on energy management, how to convert altitude into speed, speed into kinetic energy, energy into killing power. They learned to read the sky in layers, to think vertically rather than horizontally, to see enemy formations not as opponents to outmaneuver, but as targets to strike from above and below. The legendary 56th Fighter Group, known as Zemke's Wolfpack, refined these tactics into a system that combined high-altitude patrol with devastating hit-and-run attacks. They would orbit above bomber formations at 30,000 feet, scanning for German interceptors climbing to attack. When enemy fighters appeared below, the P-47s would roll into dives that could achieve closure rates exceeding 700 miles per hour, the combined speed of both aircraft. At those velocities, combat became an exercise in predictive geometry. There was no time for fancy flying, no opportunity for aerobatic maneuvers. The attacking pilot had perhaps 2 seconds to align his gun sight, account for bullet drop in time of flight, and press the trigger. Then, the enemy fighter was behind him, and he was pulling back on the stick, feeling G-forces compress his body as the Thunderbolt converted downward velocity into an arcing climb that carried him back above the combat, ready to dive again. The German response evolved slowly, hampered by fuel shortages, pilot losses, and the fundamental reality that no modification could make a Messerschmitt dive as fast as a Thunderbolt. Luftwaffe tactical officers issued directives emphasizing the importance of maintaining altitude advantage, of refusing combat when American fighters held the high ground, of attacking only when circumstances were favorable. These instructions acknowledged implicitly what German pilots had learned through bitter experience. They were no longer fighting on equal terms. The psychological burden of this knowledge eroded morale. German fighter pilots had entered the war confident in their superiority, secure in the belief that training and courage could overcome numerical disadvantages. The P-47 taught them otherwise. It taught them that industrial capacity could compensate for tactical skill, that material abundance could neutralize experience, that an enemy with unlimited resources would eventually prevail regardless of individual heroism. Pilots who had once eagerly sought combat now approached each mission with dread, knowing they might encounter aircraft they could not defeat in any consistent way. The stress manifested in rising casualty rates, not from direct combat, but from accidents, from pilots making errors in judgment, born of exhaustion and fear, from young men aged beyond their years by the daily knowledge that survival was increasingly a matter of chance rather than skill. By the summer of 1943, the Thunderbolt had achieved what strategic planners called air superiority, the ability to conduct aerial operations without prohibitive interference from enemy forces. American bomber formations that had suffered terrible losses during unescorted raids deep into Germany now reached their targets with P-47s flying cover, and German interception rates declined dramatically. The statistics told the story. In April 1943, 8th Air Force bombers sustained loss rates exceeding 10% per mission. By August, with P-47 escorts operating at full strength, loss rates had fallen below 4%. German fighter units were being worn down through attrition, losing experienced pilots faster than training schools could replace them. The newest Luftwaffe pilots arriving at frontline squadrons had logged perhaps 100 hours of flight training, compared to the 300 hours American pilots received. They flew against veterans like Robert Johnson and Francis Gabreski, men who had accumulated hundreds of hours of combat time and had learned to exploit every advantage their aircraft offered. The outcome was predictable and brutal. German pilots died in disproportionate numbers, shot down by enemies they never saw, defeated by tactics they could not counter, overwhelmed by resources they could not match. The dive, that simple geometric maneuver, that conversion of altitude into velocity into violence, became the symbol of everything the P-47 represented. It was aggression made manifest, the physical embodiment of American abundance applied to warfare. It said, "We have so much power, we can afford to throw our aircraft at the ground, trusting they will hold together. We have so much fuel, we can climb back to altitude and do it again. We have so many fighters that losing one means nothing. Another will take its place tomorrow." German pilots understood this symbolism, even if they could not articulate it. Each time a Thunderbolt dove past them at impossible speeds. Each time those 8 machine guns opened fire and tore their formation apart. They were witnessing not just tactical superiority, but systemic victory, the triumph of one nation's industrial philosophy over another's. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 had been designed by brilliant engineers working with limited resources, optimized for performance within strict weight and material constraints. It was a fighter for a nation that had to win quickly, that lacked the depth to sustain prolonged conflict. The P-47 had been designed by engineers who assumed unlimited resources, who could add weight and power until problems disappeared, who built aircraft that could absorb battle damage and keep flying because replacing structural elements was easier than designing around them. The contrast revealed fundamental differences in national character and economic capacity. Franz Stigler survived the war with 112 confirmed victories, most achieved before American long-range escorts dominated European skies. In his memoirs, published decades later, he devoted several pages to his encounters with P-47s. The writing is technical, analytical, the work of a trained aviator dissecting tactical problems. But beneath the professional language runs a current of something else. Respect, certainly. Bitterness, perhaps, and an acknowledgement that he and his comrades had been fighting not just skilled opponents, but an economic system that made defeat inevitable. A Thunderbolt was not the best fighter we faced, he wrote. The Mustang was faster in level flight, more maneuverable, had greater range. The Spitfire could turn inside it. But the Thunderbolt was the most frightening because it was so brutally effective at what it did, and what it did was remind us every day that we were losing. You cannot fight gravity, you cannot outrun physics, and you cannot win a war when your enemy can afford to build aircraft like that. Heavy, powerful, abundant, and you can barely keep fuel in the tanks of your own fighters. We called them jugs, and we meant it as an insult. But they ground us down like stones, and in the end, they won. The P-47 continued operations through the end of the war, eventually replaced by the longer-range P-51 Mustang for deep penetration escort missions, but remaining in service for ground attack roles, where its structural strength and heavy armament proved invaluable. American pilots flew Thunderbolts over France and Germany and Italy, providing close air support for advancing armies, destroying trains and trucks and bridges, absorbing flak damage that would have downed lighter aircraft. The big radial engine could lose cylinders to anti-aircraft fire and keep running. The massive wings could absorb 20mm cannon hits and maintain lift. Pilots brought home aircraft with control surfaces shot away, with hydraulic fluid streaming from severed lines, with holes large enough to crawl through. And the Thunderbolts kept flying. This durability was the final insult, the ultimate demonstration of American abundance. German pilots learned that even when they managed to hit a P-47, even when they saw their cannon shells strike home and tear metal, the American fighter often flew on, the pilot apparently unconcerned, the aircraft absorbing damage through sheer mass and redundancy. It was demoralizing in ways that transcended military defeat. It suggested an enemy operating on different principles, playing by different rules, existing in a reality where resources were unlimited and victory was simply a matter of applying sufficient force for sufficient time. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is ultimately a story about power, not just mechanical power measured in horsepower and velocity, but economic and industrial power translated into military advantage. The dive that German pilots found so terrifying was only possible because American factories could build engines powerful enough and airframes strong enough to survive the stresses involved. The tactics that proved so devastating were only sustainable because American training programs could produce pilots faster than they were lost, because American logistics could deliver fuel and ammunition to forward airfields in quantities German commanders could scarcely imagine, because American industrial capacity could absorb losses that would have paralyzed other nations. When a P-47 rolled inverted and pointed its nose at the Earth, when it fell like a meteor through frozen European skies, when German pilots scattered in panic, knowing they could not escape. It was not just one aircraft attacking. It was the weight of an entire nation bearing down, the accumulated force of factories and oil refineries and training schools and supply chains, the physical manifestation of a system that could produce enough of everything: aircraft, pilots, fuel, ammunition, confidence, to overwhelm any opponent through sheer material superiority. The dive was a message written in contrails and cannon fire. Abundance is victory, resources are destiny, and industrial capacity determines who lives and who dies. In the frozen sky above France on that January morning in 1943, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler pushed his Messerschmitt into a dive, trying to escape the American fighters falling toward him faster than seemed possible. He survived that encounter, as he would survive many others, but something changed in him that day. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that courage and skill were no longer enough. The war would not be won by aces or tactics or superior aircraft design. It would be won by the side that could put more fighters in the air, more pilots in the cockpits, more bullets in the guns. The side that could afford to build aircraft weighing 7 tons and drop them from the sky like hammers. The side that measured success not in individual victories but in statistical attrition, in loss rates and production figures and replacement schedules. The Thunderbolts dove, and in their descent was written the ending of one kind of warfare and the beginning of another, an ending to the era when individual heroism could tip the balance, a beginning to the age of industrial warfare, where victory belonged to nations that could outproduce, outlast, and overwhelm their enemies. The dive continued, gathering speed, unstoppable, inevitable, until gravity and steel and American abundance met in violence and thunder, and the sky belonged to those who could afford to own it.